let's carry on talking about how do we plan this weight cut phase for someone who it is appropriate for, someone who's at least a late stage intermediate, someone who's not a junior, someone who is in typical body fat ranges, that type of thing. And one thing you said, Brian, was you gave a certain percentage out from their weight class that you thought was good. And I actually totally agree with you. That's typically the range. Is I generally like to get someone down within 2 to 4% of what their actual on platform weight class is. And not that this is like experimental evidence supporting this to be the case, but if you look at Kedrick Kwan's survey, who's my PhD student out here doing this PhD specifically on, how do you cut weight for powerlifting and maintaining performance? He's done a series of surveys talking to high-level powerlifters at world championships and found that, basically on average, like a 3% weight cut was around the limit before it started to impact strength. So as an example, we'll go back to the 83 example since Brad brought it up. That means you're probably walking around no heavier than 85 and a half, 86. And then that's where you would want to get your cut down to before you then started doing acute manipulations. But of course, your mileage may vary. There's definitely people who cut more than that and less than that without impact, but you can really only know for practice. But if this is your first time, or if you do fall within that kind of normal bell curve, I think 3% is a really good recommendation. So you go, all right, if I need to compete in the 52s, that I only want to be 1.5 kilos over. So I need to diet down to like 53.5 or something like that. And then from there, as we talked about, getting out of the deficit, going to maintenance, and then in the final stages, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, which we're going to be talking about. Anything I left out there, gentlemen, for framing?
No, I don't think so.
I think that's, I was just going to say, I think that's the perfect way to go. Okay, how do we go about doing that? Or how have we gone about doing that? But yeah, I think you framed it perfectly.
Awesome.
So
yeah, and I think,
just to real quick,
go ahead.
Are you wanting to dive into how we would structure the fat loss on the way down there? Or are we going to start with, okay. Yeah. Okay. I just want to double check that.
Yeah.
I think
it's important because people don't get the timing right. Sometimes they cut too much weight too quickly.
Yeah.
So either the fat loss phase has to be too aggressive during a period where you're trying to actively gain strength, which we just discussed why that's not great. Or they're going to have to make a very large acute or a larger than ideal acute water weight cut, which is then like, okay, cool. We were able to preserve the strength building phase, but now we're rolling the dice on game day. We don't know how well this is going to go. And you don't want to be in either one of those positions. It's not psychologically fun to be in either one, right? Okay, you ready to do some hard, like heavy volume training for the next 6 weeks? Yes. All right, cool. We'll just drop your calories into a 1,000 calorie deficit. Sick. That matches up really well. Or no, that's fine. We can just cut 6% of our body weight, 24 hours out, and I'm sure we'll be fine to recover in 2 hours. And then you're like, I don't even want to sit down on the toilet. It's so hard and I'm so dehydrated, let alone stand up with 100 kilos on my back, So I think it's the role of a coach, among many other things, is to put our athletes in the best position to do well and reach their goals. And I think making sure they understand that neither of those outcomes is ideal is critical. But unfortunately, I think because powerlifters aren't, and this is not just powerlifters, but you don't know that if you don't know that. So a lot of powerlifters will come to you and be like, yeah, so I'm a 93. I want to compete at 83, if we're going to keep using this example, in 6 weeks. And you're like, Ebus, like that's going to be an issue. We can do it because if you're dead set on this, you're going to do it anyway. And maybe I can help you mitigate the fallout. But I think typically that's an opportunity to show the athlete that this is not the best strategy so that next time we can do it better.
Agreed. Yeah, completely. I think, getting this into a position where you can be 3% over is going to be immensely beneficial for people, and not like entering that final week. Like if you can maintain 3% over for, 4 to 6 weeks, when things are really, intensities are ramping up, some people volume is still very high at that point, or a lot of people. And so one point I wanted to bring up, the rate of loss, I think is often, less discussed when it comes to powerlifting. And, the range of 0.5 to 1% body weight loss per week, is kind of what's accepted as a reasonable rate of weight loss to preserve lean body mass. With powerlifters, in my experience, having them go on the conservative end of that range seems to work out a little bit better, because one of the reasons that we're losing strength, throughout this process is changes in leverages. And like what we mean by that, like, yeah, your limb lengths don't change, but you have less stability, at each joint, body fat. If you have, body fat in your midsection, when that goes down, you're going to have less support at the bottom of a squat. And so what, not only are you able to preserve more mass, I think that it's a less aggressive change to technique, because if you do, and if you're losing 1% or above, sometimes, and again, sometimes it depends on where the body fat is on people. Body fat distribution, I think, has an impact here too, but that can be a pretty quick and abrupt change on the technique front. And I think giving that lower percentage gives people the opportunity to kind of refine things as they go down. So what I like to do is kind of pick the date, 6 weeks out. Like, okay, we want to be, at 3% over 83, whatever that number is.
86.
85. Okay, so we want to be like 85.5 by, 6 weeks out. And then from there, let's plan on an average of 0.5% per week, and, just crunch some numbers, work backwards. And, sometimes we'll find like, okay, we should have started this diet 6 weeks ago. In those cases, we might have to, compromise and go a little bit more assertive if it's something they still want to pursue. But I think that in and of itself, that planning process is something that very few powerlifters do, because I think they look at kind of the bodybuilding side of things and kind of off-season mini cuts being somewhat more assertive. And they think, okay, like 12 pounds, 6 weeks, like it's, if I'm 200 pounds, that seems reasonable on paper, but it can be a significant, significant change if you're going that aggressively as a powerlifter.
Yeah, because the bodybuilders that they're looking to, don't even know if their 1RM squat, bench, or deadlift went down during these aggressive mini cuts. And if they did, they wouldn't care, because that's not their metric of performance. Just to give some anecdotal examples of exactly what you're talking about with, let's say you're preserving, maybe even building a little bit of muscle mass, and your strength can still be massively affected. So two things I had to actually change. I had to change my belt and my shoes as I prepped for the North Highland Champs I did back in June. So the biggest thing that was impacted by far was my bench. I mentioned that. And finding the right stability in my back changed, because I lost a lot of body fat off my back. The bar is sinking a little bit deeper into me, because I just have less body fat on my chest and my upper rib area, everywhere. And then losing a lot of body fat off my glutes meant that the inclination is changing. So I'm at less of a decline even when I try to arch. And I started to get a bruise on my chest from where the bar was touching, because it was in a different spot. And it was kind of like it used to touch just kind of on the, just below the top of my ribs. And now it was kind of right where my, the ribs meet together. What is that called? A little divot. I can't remember my anatomy. Doesn't matter. But right below my pec line is where it started to touch. And, I also started looking at my videos, and I all of a sudden I was like, wait a minute, is my ass coming off the bench? And it was. And the thing that I had to change to keep my butt down, and the reason why my ass is coming off is I wasn't doing anything different or trying to compensate and use more leg drive. It's at my normal setup, I would able to use leg drive and my butt wouldn't come off, because it would just decompress my gluteus fatius. And now there was no gluteus fatius to decompress, so it just literally lifts my glutes off the bench. And I typically would bench in my squat shoes, and I squat in Olympic shoes. So, that allows me to get a little more wedged, and get a little more arched. And I had to switch to my flats, my deadlift shoes, because it just kept my butt a little closer, and I could do my normal setup and not lose butt contact. So right there, boom, that's probably the largest part of why I basically lost a kilo per kilo of my bench with my body weight. I also thought that my deadlift was just falling off a cliff somewhere when I hit like 86, 85. And then I realized that my belt was really loose, and I hadn't changed it because I had, a lever belt, and it's a pain in the butt. So I made my lever belt one tighter, and I literally in a week put 10 kilos back on my deadlift. And I was like, oh, it's exactly where it was. This is great. But then I started to get bruises on my ribs because it's a thick, not very flexible, ins or lever belt. And I was like, oh, this is not like, this is too uncomfortable. This is not working. It's actually messing up, like it's distracting. And the only difference was that I just had more fat on my midsection before to kind of prevent this bruising. So on my journey to being a tiny waif, I've had to accommodate my fragility. And one of the the things that I had to change to was going to my old super broken in 2005 10 millimeter prong belt. So, I show up on the platform, people are like, why are you benching in your flats? And also, why are you deadlifting in your prong belt? And I'm like, because I'm a little baby now. You got to leave me alone. Same reason I have to wear a scarf when I go walk outside. I might get sicky wicky. So yeah, like I think people don't know to anticipate that, and that's obviously a little more on the extreme end of getting very lean. But there are the equivalent of that anytime you drop substantial weight. You drop from a one weight class to another, you are in a different body to some degree. The way the bar feels on your back when you set up for low bar, how far you can get it down without it slipping, or whether you need to chalk up, how close you can have your hands to your shoulders. Your mobility changes a little bit. All this stuff is actually quite different. So I think people don't anticipate that. And even when you can correct for it, there's absolutely like a technique lag. Like when you're in the active dropping weight phase, you go right from there to competition, you're going to be in a body that's like, oh, I'm trying to refigure out my squat and my bench at the very least. And sometimes my deadlift. Sometimes the deadlift gets better. It's not all bad, especially if you're a sumo puller. It depends on how much body weight you dropped and where you carried it. But I think it's way better to have a mesocycle of training to kind of let your body refigure out the technique and not be actively dropping body mass. I think that's another feather in the cap of the protocol that you guys are describing of, all right, I want to be 3% over, at least 2 weeks out, if not 3 or 4 weeks out, which is probably ideal or even further. Anything else that you wanted to add, Brad?
No, in fact, you outlined the changes and leverages. We've talked about that many times, but I thought your examples were fantastic.
Yeah, those were good.
They really were. Because even I've been unable to figure out why things feel different a lot of times, but Eric, if I can play moderator hat for a second, I'll kind of kick us off. I'd love to hear how you got there, because you were obviously in a bodybuilding prep, right? And so we know that you were losing body fat, you were dieting, et cetera, et cetera. I know for myself, probably the best, the most success that I've ever had cutting for a powerlifting meet. First of all, to kind of frame it, like you talked about earlier, I was basically going from like 167 to 162, right? So we're talking 5 pounds, right? And so I wanted to make the 74s for USAPL Raw National. So I didn't have to drop a whole lot of weight, right? Arguably I didn't have to drop any, but I just wanted to make sure. And so I wasn't tracking macros at the time. I had just got done. I think I was actually in the midst of doing a guest posing with Jeff at the Battle of the Bay in California. And then someone else was doing my programming. And basically the way that to summarize the way that I dieted is I was able to recognize through the programming that my coach was doing at the time, when volume was going to become kind of ramping up, or when I could see my plan for the week and I knew it was going to be up, or when it was going to be down. And all that I would basically do is I'd say, well, you know what? Volume is coming way down this week. I'm going to be a little hungrier. I'm going to keep my protein the same, but I'm just going to let my stomach growl a little bit, probably eat my same structure of meals and just, not be as full, And then I would do that for what I could kind of recognize was the duration of that lower volume phase. And then when I saw the volume was coming back up again, then I would basically kind of eat a little bit more. I would just be a little bit fuller. You know what I mean? I would make sure that I was not having the stomach growling as much. And that was really the extent of it. I made sure that my protein was always fixed. And I just recognized cycles. And I actually, you know, when I think about it, I outlined this in my course on 3DMJ Vault, the gaining strength while cutting. I outlined this, but I was able to just recognize without tracking macros or tracking my calories or any of that. I wasn't being too OCD, which is very unlike Brad. And I just used my hunger signals and recognized when training was either going to be ramped up or come down, and then adjusted my hunger cues accordingly. And I mean, it worked like a charm. You know, I mean, there would be weeks where I wouldn't lose any weight at all, but then the very next couple of weeks I'd lose, you know, a pound or two, and there was body composition changes happening. So it wasn't like I just all of a sudden looked 2 pounds lighter just because I just dropped 2 pounds in 2 weeks. It was this kind of slow, gradual process, because the average was basically a half a pound a week, right? Just because I dropped 2 pounds, it doesn't mean that my body composition changed that much. It was that the body composition was changing slowly the whole time. And now it's being reflected on the scale. You know what I mean? It kind of goes, that's that whoosh that we talk about. And keep in mind too, that was really my first, I had done powerlifting meets before, but I would still have classified myself at the time as barely an intermediate. So I'm dropping 5-6 pounds, barely an intermediate probably at the time. And so I was getting I was holding on to my strength very well because I was so early in my powerlifting career, right? And I actually think that like you said, because I'm a sumo puller, Eric, I think my deadlift actually did go up a little bit during that period of time. So that kind of just reinforces what you talked about earlier, is as long as your weight cut is acceptable, or not acceptable, that's stupid. As long as your weight cut is not very severe, right? And you kind of are recognizing where you're at in your lifting career, it's not impossible, you know, to kind of gain strength while you're cutting down. It's just, you have to take into consideration all those little factors. But that's kind of how I did it. And people that are in the similar situation, I'll still do that kind of to this day if I'm lucky enough to coach them.